Hey guys, tonight we begin behind closed doors in medieval Europe. Not with the grand tales of chivalry, but with the raw, risky truth of what it meant to desire someone you weren't supposed to in a world that controlled every aspect of your romantic life. We're stepping into a time when love affairs could start a war, when adultery might get you literally locked in a tower, and when your neighbour's marriage drama was basically the medieval equivalent of reality TV, except with more actual execution. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. All's fair in love and war, said absolutely no one in the 14th century, because fair wasn't really the point. In the early Middle Ages, marriage was less about love and more about livestock trading. But affairs, those were where the real passion lived, hidden behind tapestries, whispered in monastery gardens, and conducted with the kind of dramatic flair that would make modern soap opera writers weep with envy. Medieval affairs weren't just about stolen kisses and secret letters. They were political dynamite, wrapped in silk scarves. When Eleanor of Aquitaine had her rumoured dalliances, or when Heloise fell for Abelard, these weren't just romantic scandals. They were geopolitical events that could shift the balance of power faster than you could say conjugal rights. In short, medieval affairs operated on a completely different moral compass than today. What we might consider a private matter between consenting adults was, in the medieval world, a complex web of honour, property, spiritual damnation, and occasionally very public humiliation, involving wooden stocks and rotten vegetables. People believed that love, especially the illicit kind, was a dangerous force that could literally drive you insane. Medical texts warned that excessive passion could cause melancholy, fever, and even death. Imagine having to explain to your physician that you were lovesick and having them prescribe bloodletting and a diet of cold lettuce to cool your ardour. That was the medieval approach to romantic medicine. It didn't help that the church had very specific opinions about what constituted proper relationships. Marriage was a sacrament, but it was also a business transaction. Love was acceptable, as long as it didn't interfere with God's plan or your father's financial arrangements. Anything outside of marriage wasn't just morally questionable, it was spiritually hazardous. So instead of simply pursuing happiness, many medieval folks found themselves navigating a maze of competing loyalties to their spouse, to their lord, to their family's honour, to their own desires, and to a God who was supposedly watching everything with the patience of a medieval tax collector. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like emotionally repressed chess pieces. People still fell in love, still felt passion, still yearned for connection. They just had to get very creative about expressing it, often in ways that involved coded poetry, elaborate courtship rituals, and the occasional dramatic elopement that ended with someone getting excommunicated. So yes, medieval people had affairs, but not because they were morally loose or romantically naive. They were trying, in their own 12th century way, to balance the competing demands of heart, duty, and survival. Unfortunately, without modern concepts of personal autonomy, divorce courts, or couples therapy, the strategy was more about creative deception than open communication. Once upon a time, in a world that didn't yet understand the concept of "it's complicated" as a relationship status, courtly love emerged as the medieval solution to a very medieval problem. How to have romantic feelings without getting burned at the stake, literally or figuratively. Courtly love, or phenomenon, as it was known in the more refined circles, was essentially a sophisticated system for channeling romantic energy into something socially acceptable. Think of it as medieval emotional management, complete with rules, rituals, and an entire literary genre devoted to explaining why suffering was actually good for your character. The basic premise was revolutionary for its time. A knight could devotedly love a lady, usually married and of higher social status, and express this love through service, poetry, and elaborate gestures of devotion. The catch: the love was supposed to remain unconsummated, or at least unspoken, existing in a perpetual state of noble yearning. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century cleric, literally wrote the manual on this. His Art of Courtly Love laid out rules that read like a medieval dating app's terms of service. Love cannot exist between married couples, marriage being a business arrangement. True love is always increasing or decreasing, never static, and secrecy is essential to love's survival. Then things got steamy in the most intellectually complicated way possible. By the 13th century, courtly love had acquired a reputation for being less about courtly and more about love. Some courts began offering extra services, with troubadours who were suspiciously friendly, and poetry that had seen far too many private chambers. The line between spiritual devotion and physical attraction blurred faster than a manuscript left in the rain. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Unrequited love, even when paired with a sonnet, was frowned upon. Excessive devotion to anyone other than God, even worse. Courtly love became synonymous with temptation, desire, and spiritual peril. And once accusations of adultery started flying, people were more than happy to abandon the whole enterprise and go back to arranged marriages and emotional repression. But it wasn't just sin and scandal that doomed courtly love, it was practicality. Over time, the elaborate rituals of courtship began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of a knight spending months composing verses to another man's wife felt like a gateway to both adultery and treason. And so, one by one, the courts of love closed. Some were transformed into more conventional social gatherings. Others were simply abandoned and left to gather dust. A poetic fate, really, for a movement meant to elevate romantic yearning to an art form. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly lamented the loss. Many had maintained scholarly interests in the poetry and philosophy of courtly love for centuries, including careful translations of troubadour lyrics. But now even that was in question. The church wasn't banning romantic literature outright, just making it incredibly difficult to possess without raising eyebrows. Thus began the golden age of secret love letters, hidden beneath prayer books and disguised as theological treatises. Despite the church's growing horror at passionate poetry and the widespread belief that romantic love could literally make you sick, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of courtship. They just turned it into something you do once a season, or when the arranged marriage became particularly unbearable. Let's begin with the nobles. Yes, wealthy people had affairs, though not so often that their illuminated manuscripts got scandalous. They had servants arrange secret meetings because privacy was still centuries away from being invented. These romantic encounters were often scheduled around feast days or hunting expeditions, when the castle was full of guests and confusion provided cover. This wasn't so much an affair as it was a carefully orchestrated diplomatic mission with kissing. The rendezvous was often arranged in the ladies' chambers or in secluded gardens, always with at least one trusted servant acting as lookout. Privacy was optional, depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some even conducted affairs through intermediaries, because what's more romantic than having someone else deliver your love letters like a medieval email service? The poor had affairs too, but usually in barns, fields, or anywhere that held privacy and didn't involve explaining yourself to a priest. It wasn't about grand romantic gestures, it was about efficiency. Might as well meet the miller's daughter after evening prayers, was probably said more than once. In winter, affairs took a back seat to survival, so instead of passionate encounters, people turned to a strategy known as right-longing poetry and just keep your head down. A few urban areas maintained romantic meet-up spots, particularly in southern Europe, where warmer weather and more cosmopolitan attitudes kept the dream of clandestine love alive. These were sometimes well-established rendezvous points, with coded signals and discreet entrances. Other times, they doubled as venues for activities not approved by local bishops. Either way, you left refreshed, mildly compromised, and possibly slightly excommunicated for special occasions. Like harvest festivals or religious pilgrimages, people would arrange elaborate affairs because nothing says spiritual journey like meeting your lover 3 towns away from your spouse. When full romantic pursuit became suspect, thanks to the belief that passionate love invited madness like an open tavern door, the medieval world turned to the next best thing, coded communication. Except they didn't really have reliable postal services, at least not the discreet kind you could trust with your deepest secrets. Instead, they used symbols, songs, and elaborate metaphors that required a university education to decode. Love letters were disguised as religious texts, romantic poetry was hidden in the margins of business ledgers, and meaningful glances were choreographed like a very subtle form of medieval sign language. Courtship in this context meant everything and nothing. If you were lucky, someone else interpreted the signals for you. If you were noble, someone else wrote them reluctantly. These coded messages focused on flowers. Roses meant passion, violets meant faithfulness. Colours, wearing blue might signal devotion, while red suggested availability. And music, certain songs were understood to carry romantic meaning. The challenge was that everyone's interpretation was slightly different, leading to confusion, misunderstandings, and occasionally accidental proposals to the wrong person. Your intended love interest might think you were expressing religious devotion when you were actually suggesting a midnight meeting. Your spouse might assume you were commissioning a new tapestry when you were really planning an elopement. Under layers of symbolism, particularly hidden meanings in gift-giving and public behaviour, people managed to conduct entire romantic relationships without ever speaking directly about their feelings. Changing your hair arrangement regularly was about as close to modern romantic communication as you were going to get. Your hunting party invitation might have been courteous, but your choice of falcon could be sending a very different message. And in a world without clear romantic protocols, jewellery, or straightforward conversation, a thoughtful arrangement of wildflowers was the medieval equivalent of a heartfelt text message, minus the delivery confirmation. For wealthier folks, professional poets might compose coded verses, mix in acceptable religious imagery, and gently suggest romantic intentions while pretending not to judge them openly. Peasants would rely on traditional songs, seasonal festivals, and the hope that their intended understood the difference between friendliness and romantic interest. Either way, the result was the same: elaborate emotional navigation, a whisper of possibility, and a renewed sense of being just secretive enough to avoid immediate text communication. So no, it wasn't straightforward, but it worked. More or less. At least until you had to explain to your confessor why you'd been giving away so many symbolic flowers. If medieval love letters had a motto, it would probably be passionate but disguised as a grocery list. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't just rely on verbal communication to conduct their affairs. They did in fact write extensively to each other, just not frequently, and certainly not with anything resembling modern directness. So what did they use? A variety of literary techniques that sounded like the first draft of a prayer book. One popular approach was religious allegory, where earthly love was described in terms of divine devotion. This was great for avoiding suspicion and also for completely confusing anyone who intercepted your mail. Others used classical mythology, comparing their beloved to Venus or their suffering to that of tragic heroes. For those hoping to preserve some dignity, agricultural metaphors were sometimes employed. describing the beloved as a fertile field waiting for spring, which if nothing else made you sound like a very romantic farmer. Some love letter collections included elaborate acrostics, where the first letter of each line spelled out a hidden message. Others used numerical codes, symbolic drawings, or references to shared memories that only the intended recipient would understand. Hair washing, on the other hand, was purely practical. Love letters weren't frequently cleaned or preserved. They were meant to be read, memorized, and often destroyed to avoid discovery. Paper was expensive, and leaving evidence of an affair lying around was considered poor romantic strategy. Temperature also mattered when writing. Hot emotions were believed to cloud judgment. Cold emotions could freeze the ink. Warm feelings were the sweet spot, assuming you had access to decent writing materials and weren't worried about your handwriting being recognised by unwanted eyes. Brushing up on your literacy, on the other hand, was essential. Most love letters were written by scribes or educated clergy members who charged for their services and occasionally blackmailed their clients. Taking pride in personally written correspondence was a luxury, especially when illiteracy meant relying on potentially untrustworthy intermediaries to handle your most sensitive communications. Noble women in particular might spend hours getting their love letters dictated, translated, and beautifully illustrated, all while hoping a nearby chapel bell didn't undo their romantic efforts with an ill-timed call to prayer. Secret meetings in medieval Europe were less sparkling romance and more, "I still have most of my reputation. What's your excuse?" Now, to their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore the logistics of clandestine encounters. They didn't exactly understand operational security either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly architectural knowledge, seasonal timing, and blind hope. There were no private hotel rooms. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used monastery guest quarters, abandoned buildings, or secluded spots in forests, ideally chosen for their distance from both the village church and any well-travelled roads. The goal wasn't comfort, it was avoiding detection. If your secret meeting didn't result in immediate public scandal, you were already winning. Some opted for seasonal gatherings, like harvest festivals or market days, when crowds provided cover and everyone was too busy with commerce to pay attention to who was slipping away with whom. You could arrange to meet during the chaos of a feast day and hope that between the drinking and the dancing, no one would notice your temporary absence. To plan a rendezvous, people relied on go-betweens, usually trusted servants or sympathetic clergy members, depending on what they could afford or how much moral flexibility their contacts possessed. These intermediaries would carry messages, scout locations, and occasionally provide alibis. Some meetings were coordinated through shared activities like pilgrimages, where travelling together for religious purposes provided legitimate cover for extended private conversations. Others used hunting parties where the excuse of tracking game through dense forests offered plenty of opportunities to wander off the established path. And if you're wondering about timing, it varied considerably. Some affairs were brief encounters scheduled around religious obligations, while others were ongoing relationships maintained through careful planning and social camouflage. The key was consistency without pattern, regular enough to maintain connection, irregular enough to avoid suspicion. Despite all this, medieval people weren't necessarily more skilled at discretion than modern lovers. Diets were often documented in household records, making it difficult to explain why certain individuals were frequently absent at the same times. Many rural folks had better operational security than their urban counterparts, simply because everyone knew everyone's business anyway, so unusual behaviour was more quickly noticed and commented upon. But when secrecy did fail, it failed spectacularly, and the only discretion strong enough to fix it was divine intervention or a very convincing story about sudden religious conversion. Let's be honest, if you time travelled to a bustling medieval court, your first reaction wouldn't be admiration for the romantic intrigue. It would be shock at how public everything was, because medieval privacy was about as reliable as medieval dentistry, which is to say, painful and probably going to end badly. Medieval courts, especially royal ones, operated like fish bowls filled with very attractive, very ambitious fish, all watching each other constantly. Romance in this environment wasn't private, it was performed. Every glance, every conversation, every gift exchange was noted, analysed, and gossiped about by people whose primary job was literally to pay attention to other people's business. So how did people conduct affairs in this social panopticon? They got creative. Enter the elaborate system of court etiquette, which served as both social regulation and romantic camouflage. Formal interactions provided cover for meaningful exchanges, and traditional ceremonies created opportunities for private moments. Ladies-in-waiting became crucial accomplices, arranging informal meetings during formal events, carrying messages disguised as routine correspondence, and creating diversions when needed. Think of them as medieval relationship facilitators, except their services came with the understanding that discretion was literally a matter of life and death. Court entertainments also provided cover. Musical performances, theatrical presentations, and elaborate feasts created enough sensory distraction that careful lovers could exchange meaningful looks, brief touches, or whispered words without immediate detection. The key was timing and subtlety. For those with access to larger castles, architecture itself became an ally. Hidden passages, private chapels, and walled gardens offered temporary refuge from constant observation. Some affairs were conducted entirely through a series of brief, carefully choreographed encounters in semi-public spaces. Enough interaction to maintain emotional connection, not enough to provoke scandal. Then there were the environmental challenges. Open windows meant conversations could be overheard. Thin walls made privacy nearly impossible, and servants had access to private chambers at all hours. Cities were often enveloped in a fog of scrutiny, where even walking alone with someone of the opposite sex could start rumours. The church encouraged spiritual relationships, but physical attraction was left largely to individual management. If you maintained appropriate public behaviour, people assumed you were virtuous, or at least adequately self-controlled. If you didn't, you were just another court scandal waiting to happen. If you've ever tried to maintain a secret relationship while living with your parents, you have a small taste of what medieval affairs were like, except your parents were the entire feudal system, and getting caught meant potential excommunication, rather than just an awkward conversation over breakfast. Medieval affairs operated under the constant threat of discovery, and the consequences ranged from social embarrassment to literal death, depending on your social status, the political climate, and how many powerful people your romantic choices might offend. There were no relationship counsellors, no privacy laws, and certainly no cultural narrative about following your heart. People simply conducted their affairs and then made peace with the constant anxiety that someone somewhere was keeping track of their romantic inventory. To manage the psychological pressure, people employed various coping mechanisms. One common approach was religious justification, framing romantic love as a form of spiritual devotion, albeit directed toward an earthly rather than divine object. This didn't actually make affairs acceptable to the church, but it helped individuals reconcile their actions with their faith. Others used courtly love traditions as emotional camouflage, maintaining that their feelings were pure, elevated, and expressed only through poetry and symbolic gestures. Even when this wasn't entirely true, the cultural framework provided some protection against accusations of base lust or moral corruption. Some developed elaborate systems of plausible deniability, ensuring that any romantic meeting could be explained as business, family obligation, or religious devotion. The logic was simple. If you can't prevent suspicion, at least make it difficult to prove. In fact, some of the most successful medieval affairs were those that appeared to be something else entirely. Relationships disguised as patronage, spiritual guidance, or scholarly collaboration could continue for years without attracting unwanted attention, assuming both parties were skilled at maintaining their cover story. Then there was the psychological defense of collective acceptance. Everyone around you was managing their own romantic complications, so the goal wasn't to be perfectly virtuous, but to be no more scandalous than your peers. Medieval medicine also played its part. Physicians believed that suppressing natural desires could cause physical illness, so some amount of romantic expression was seen as necessary for health. You weren't being immoral, you were just medically fragrant. In short, emotional management wasn't just about individual psychology, it was a social skill necessary for navigating a world where everyone had feelings, but expressing them inappropriately could ruin your life and possibly end it. In a world without divorce lawyers, medieval people turned to an unlikely source of relationship guidance, the church, not for marriage counselling in the modern sense, but for a complex system of rules, exceptions, and creative interpretations that could sometimes untangle even the most complicated romantic situations. Canon law, the church's legal system, governed marriage, sexuality, and family relationships with the thoroughness of a modern tax code, and about the same level of user-friendliness. But for those willing to navigate its complexities, it offered surprising flexibility. Take annulment, for instance. While divorce was impossible under church law, marriages could be declared invalid if certain conditions were met. Consanguinity, being too closely related, was a popular grounds for annulment, especially since medieval record-keeping made it relatively easy to discover or fabricate familial connections. Impotence was another acceptable reason for annulment, though proving it required medical examination and sometimes public testimony that would make modern court proceedings seem discreet by comparison. Force or coercion at the time of marriage could also invalidate the union, though proving this years after the fact required considerable legal creativity. The Church also recognized the concept of spiritual relationships that superseded earthly obligations. In rare cases, individuals could claim that their true calling was religious rather than marital, though this usually required entering a monastery or convent and wasn't exactly a convenient solution for most affairs. For those seeking more temporary relief, pilgrimage offered legitimate reasons for extended separation from spouses. A journey to Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem could take months or even years, during which normal marital obligations were suspended and geographic distance provided its own form of relationship management. Some couples even arranged mutual entries into religious orders, effectively ending their marriage while maintaining spiritual connection. This was considered more honourable than adultery and sometimes allowed for continued communication and even occasional visits under appropriate supervision. The clergy also served as informal relationship counsellors, though their advice typically focused on spiritual rather than emotional satisfaction. A sympathetic priest might help arrange geographic separation, suggest appropriate forms of penance for past indiscretions, or provide spiritual justification for difficult romantic decisions. But perhaps the most creative solution was the concept of courtly love as a form of religious devotion. By maintaining that their feelings were pure, elevated, and unconsummated, lovers could sometimes continue their emotional relationships with minimal church interference, especially if they expressed them through appropriately spiritual poetry and public charitable works. Before we begin diving into the juicy scandals that made medieval courts more entertaining than modern reality television, It's worth understanding that love affairs in this period weren't just personal drama. They were potential political disasters that could topple kingdoms, start wars, and reshape the map of Europe. Medieval noble marriages were essentially international treaties sealed with wedding rings. When someone decided to ignore their marital obligations in favour of passion, they weren't just breaking hearts. They were potentially breaking alliances, trade agreements, and carefully negotiated peace settlements. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, who managed to be married to 2 kings and rumoured to have affairs with several others, including possibly her uncle Raymond of Antioch during the Second Crusade. Her romantic choices helped end one royal marriage, start another, and contributed to conflicts that lasted for decades. She wasn't just following her heart, she was accidentally redesigning the political landscape of Western Europe. Or consider the legendary affair between Tristan and Isolde, which became the template for tragic medieval romance. While probably mythological, the story reflects real concerns about the consequences of love trumping loyalty. Tristan was supposed to escort Isolde to marry his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall. Instead, they fell in love, conducted a secret affair, and the resulting scandal threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. These weren't isolated incidents. Medieval literature is full of stories about romantic passion disrupting political order. Lancelot and Guinevere undermining Arthur's Camelot, Paris and Helen launching the Trojan War, and countless lesser nobles whose affairs resulted in exile, warfare, or family feuds that lasted for generations. The political stakes made medieval affairs particularly dangerous because they involved more than just the immediate participants. A noblewoman's adultery could be seen as treason against her husband's authority and, by extension, against the feudal system itself. A nobleman's affair with another man's wife could be interpreted as an act of political aggression, essentially claiming dominance over a rival's household and honour. This is why medieval romance literature often focused on secret, unconsummated love rather than fulfilled passion. The tension and tragedy weren't just dramatic devices, they reflected the real-world consequences of allowing personal desire to override political necessity. Even the church's obsession with marital fidelity had political dimensions. Marriage was a sacrament, but it was also a cornerstone of social order. Adultery didn't just threaten individual souls, it threatened the stability of the entire feudal hierarchy. And yet people still fell in love, still had affairs, still risked everything for moments of connection and passion. The difference was that they did so knowing the stakes weren't just personal happiness, but potentially the peace and prosperity of entire regions. When we examine the most famous medieval love affairs, we're not just looking at personal relationships, we're seeing how individual desires shaped the course of European history, often in ways the lovers themselves never intended or anticipated. Let's start with the most scandalous affair in medieval literature, which may or may not have happened, but definitely shaped how people thought about love, loyalty, and the catastrophic consequences of both. The tale of Lancelot and Guinevere wasn't just entertainment, it was a cautionary story about what happens when the heart overrules the head, and when personal passion threatens public order. According to the various Arthurian romances, Lancelot was the greatest knight of the Round Table, bound by oath to serve King Arthur with perfect loyalty. Guinevere was Arthur's queen, the living symbol of his authority and the stability of Camelot. Their affair, whether consummated or merely emotional, represented the ultimate betrayal of feudal bonds. But here's what makes the story particularly medieval. The affair isn't portrayed as simply immoral. Lancelot and Guinevere are depicted as genuinely loving each other, trapped between authentic emotion and social obligation. Their relationship embodies the central tension of courtly love. the idea that true passion exists outside of marriage, but expressing it destroys the very social order that makes civilization possible. Different versions of the story handle the affair differently. In some, it remains chaste but emotionally intense. In others, it's fully consummated but filled with guilt and spiritual anguish. What remains consistent is the outcome. The affair's discovery leads to civil war, the destruction of Camelot, and Arthur's death. This wasn't just storytelling, it was social commentary. Medieval audiences understood that the Round Table represented an idealized feudal society where personal loyalty, martial valor, and spiritual devotion created perfect harmony. Lancelot and Guinevere's affair shows how individual desire, no matter how noble or genuine, can unravel even the most perfect social system. The political implications were clear to medieval readers. Kings depended on the absolute loyalty of their knights and the unquestioned virtue of their queens. If the greatest knight could betray his lord for love, and if the queen could prefer another man to her royal husband, then the entire basis of monarchical authority was questionable. But the story also reflected real medieval anxieties about the conflict between Christian teaching and human nature. The church taught that sexual desire should be channeled exclusively into procreative marriage, but everyone knew that passion didn't follow theological guidelines. Lancelot and Guinevere represented the tragic gap between ideal Christian behaviour and actual human experience. Different medieval authors used the affair to explore various themes. Chrétien de Troyes emphasised the ennobling power of courtly love, even when it led to tragic consequences. The anonymous author of the Vulgate cycle focused on the spiritual dimensions, showing how earthly love could either elevate or damn the soul, depending on how it was managed. By the late medieval period, the story had become a mirror for contemporary concerns about marriage, loyalty, and the tension between personal fulfillment and social responsibility. Aristocratic readers could see their own struggles reflected in the impossible choices faced by Arthur's court. The affair's enduring popularity suggests that medieval people found something both compelling and terrifying in the idea that love could be simultaneously the highest expression of human nature and the force that destroys everything people work to build and maintain. Now let's move from legend to documented history, because medieval Europe produced plenty of real scandals that were just as dramatic as anything in Arthurian romance, and often had much more concrete political consequences. The affair between Abelard and Heloise stands out not only for its passion and tragedy, but for the extraordinary written record they left behind. Love letters that give us an unprecedented glimpse into medieval romantic psychology. Peter Abelard was one of the most famous philosophers and theologians of the 12th century, renowned throughout Europe for his brilliance, his arrogance, and his ability to demolish his intellectual opponents in public debates. Heloise was his student, a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and education, niece to Canon Fulbert of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. What began as a tutoring arrangement quickly became an intense intellectual and romantic relationship. Abelard later wrote that he deliberately sought the position as Heloise's teacher because he was already attracted to her, and that their lessons soon became opportunities for intimate conversations and eventually physical intimacy. Their affair continued for months, conducted in secret but growing increasingly passionate. When Heloise became pregnant, they married secretly, but her uncle Fulbert was furious at what he saw as the seduction and dishonouring of his niece. The secret marriage wasn't enough to satisfy his anger or protect his family's reputation. What happened next was medieval justice at its most brutal. Fulbert arranged for several men to break into Abelard's quarters at night and castrate him. The attack was both revenge and practical politics. It ensured that Abelard would never again be able to seduce anyone's daughter or niece, and it effectively ended his secular career. Following the attack, both Abelard and Heloise entered religious life. He became a monk, she became a nun. But their separation didn't end their relationship. It transformed it into something even more complex and psychologically intense. Years later, they began corresponding, and their letters reveal a relationship that was simultaneously spiritual, intellectual, and still deeply emotional. Heloise's letters, in particular, are remarkable for their emotional honesty and their sophisticated analysis of love, duty, and religious devotion. She wrote to Abelard that she had entered the convent not from religious calling, but from love for him, and that her heart remained entirely his despite her religious vows. She questioned whether her sacrifices had any spiritual value if they were motivated by human love, rather than divine devotion. Abelard's responses show him trying to redirect their relationship toward appropriate spiritual channels, while clearly still being emotionally affected by her letters. He encouraged her to focus on her religious duties and to consider their past relationship as a form of divine teaching about the dangers of earthly passion. But what makes their correspondence so remarkable is how it reveals the psychological complexity of medieval people trying to navigate the conflict between personal desire and religious obligation. These weren't simple people living in a simple time. They were sophisticated individuals struggling with the same fundamental questions about love, meaning, and identity that continue to challenge people today. Their affair also illustrates how intellectual relationships could be just as dangerous as purely physical ones in medieval society. Abelard wasn't just Heloise's lover, he was her teacher and intellectual mentor. Their relationship crossed multiple boundaries, social, sexual, and pedagogical, in ways that threatened several different forms of authority. The brutal punishment Abelard suffered reflects how seriously medieval society took these boundary crossings. Fulbert's revenge wasn't just about family honour, it was about maintaining the social order that depended on clear hierarchies and appropriate relationships between teachers and students, men and women, clergy and laity. Yet the letters also show how these same social constraints could transform and intensify emotional relationships. Separated by religious vows and physical distance, Abelard and Heloise developed a form of intimacy that was simultaneously more spiritual and more psychologically sophisticated than their original affair. Their story became a model for later medieval discussions about the relationship between intellectual, emotional, and spiritual connection, and about whether human love could be transformed into divine love, or whether the two are fundamentally incompatible. Medieval royal courts were like pressure cookers for romantic drama, combining attractive people, political ambition, forced proximity, and high stakes in ways that inevitably produced spectacular scandals. The affair between King Henry II of England and Rosamund Clifford illustrates how royal adultery could become a kind of public theatre, with consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Henry II was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and politically sophisticated women of the medieval period. Their marriage was a political alliance that brought together vast territories and created one of the largest empires in medieval Europe. It was also, by most accounts, a relationship of mutual respect and occasional genuine affection, at least in its early years. But Henry was known for his sexual appetites and his tendency to pursue relationships with other women. Medieval kings were generally expected to be discreet about their extramarital affairs, but Henry seemed to take particular pleasure in making his relationship with Rosamund Clifford semi-public. Rosamund, known as Fair Rosamund, was reportedly a woman of extraordinary beauty from a minor noble family. Henry installed her in a residence at Woodstock Palace and visited her regularly, making little effort to conceal the relationship from Hugh, his court or his queen. According to later legends, Henry built an elaborate maze garden at Woodstock to conceal Rosamund's residence, and only he knew the secret path to reach her chambers. The story, whether historically accurate or not, captured the medieval imagination because it combined romantic secrecy with royal power in ways that seemed both romantic and slightly sinister. Eleanor's response to the affair reveals the political complexity of royal marriages. She couldn't simply express jealousy or demand that Henry end the relationship. That would have made her appear weak and would have given Henry's enemies opportunities to exploit divisions in the royal marriage. Instead, she used the affair as justification for her own political manoeuvring, eventually supporting her son's rebellion against their father and spending years in what amounted to comfortable house arrest. As a result, the personal betrayal became political opposition, and the political opposition justified increased personal autonomy. Legend claims that Eleanor eventually confronted Rosamund directly, offering her a choice between poison and a dagger, essentially forcing her to commit suicide to avoid a more painful death. While this story is almost certainly fictional, it reflects medieval anxieties about the power of queens and the dangers of royal love triangles. The historical Rosamund seems to have died of natural causes sometime in the 1170s, but her affair with Henry had already served its political purpose. It had demonstrated Henry's masculine virility and his power to do as he pleased, while simultaneously providing Eleanor with grievances that she could use to justify her own political activities. The affair also illustrates how medieval royal relationships operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Henry and Rosamund may have been genuinely attached to each other, but their relationship was also a form of political communication, a way for Henry to demonstrate his power and autonomy while sending messages to his wife, his nobles, and his enemies about who was really in charge. Royal affairs weren't private matters. They were public performances with audiences that included the entire political establishment of medieval Europe. Every aspect of the relationship, how it began, how it was conducted, how it ended, was scrutinized for political meaning and strategic implications. This is why Fair Rosamund became such a popular figure in later medieval literature. She represented the fantasy of pure romantic love existing within the brutal realities of royal politics. And her tragic end reinforced the moral lesson that earthly passion, no matter how beautiful, was ultimately destructive. But she also represented something more subversive, the idea that even kings were subject to emotional forces beyond their political control, and that personal desire could disrupt the most carefully planned dynastic strategies. Moving beyond the English court, let's examine another form of medieval romantic scandal: the affairs that developed within religious communities. The relationship between Abelard and Heloise wasn't unique in involving clerical figures. Medieval monasteries and convents were filled with intelligent, passionate people who had often entered religious life for practical rather than spiritual reasons. The affair between the monk Guibert and the Benedictine nun Herod von Landsberg illustrates how religious environments could actually intensify rather than suppress romantic feelings. Both were intellectuals, involved in manuscript copying and scholarly work, which required regular communication and collaboration. Their relationship began as professional correspondence about theological questions, but gradually became more personal and emotionally intimate. They developed a coded language for expressing feelings that couldn't be stated directly, using biblical metaphors and theological concepts to convey romantic meaning. What made their affair particularly dangerous was that it involved not just breaking vows of celibacy, but challenging the fundamental structure of medieval religious life. Monks and nuns weren't just prohibited from sexual relationships, they were supposed to have transcended earthly desire entirely. Yet their letters reveal people who were deeply human, struggling with loneliness, intellectual isolation, and the natural human need for emotional connection. Their affair was conducted entirely through correspondence, but the emotional intensity was arguably greater than many physical relationships. The discovery of their letters led to severe punishment for both. Guibert was transferred to a remote monastery and subjected to prolonged penance. Herat was confined to her cell and forbidden from any scholarly work. Their intellectual collaboration, which had produced valuable theological writings, was completely suppressed. Their case illustrates how medieval society struggled with the tension between spiritual ideals and human nature. The Church demanded absolute celibacy from its clergy, but it also placed intelligent, attractive people in close proximity and expected them to collaborate intellectually without developing emotional attachments. The punishment they received reflected not just moral outrage, but institutional anxiety about the stability of religious communities. If monks and nuns could conduct romantic relationships through their scholarly work, then the entire system of religious education and manuscript production was potentially compromised. Yet their letters, which survived despite official attempts at suppression, reveal a sophistication and depth of feeling that challenges stereotypes about medieval emotional life. These were people capable of profound intellectual and emotional connection, forced by their social circumstances to express these connections in hidden and ultimately tragic ways. Now let's explore how ordinary people, peasants, merchants, craftspeople, managed their romantic lives in a world designed around noble marriages and clerical celibacy. Without the political implications of royal affairs or the institutional complications of clerical relationships, common folk developed their own strategies for navigating love, desire, and social expectation. Medieval peasant communities operated on principles of collective survival and mutual oversight that made privacy nearly impossible, but also created forms of romantic tolerance that might surprise modern observers. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but this intimate knowledge also meant that community standards evolved to accommodate human nature rather than simply suppress it. Take the practice of bundling, which allowed unmarried couples to spend nights together fully clothed and under community supervision. This wasn't about promoting sexual activity, but about providing opportunities for emotional connection and practical courtship in societies where privacy was a luxury few could afford. Young people would lie together in bed, separated by a wooden board or wrapped in separate blankets, and spend hours talking, getting to know each other's personalities, values, and life goals. It was simultaneously intimate and public, romantic and practical. If pregnancy resulted from these supervised courtships, community pressure usually ensured marriage followed quickly. But the system also recognised that emotional compatibility was important for successful marriages, even when those marriages were primarily economic partnerships. Seasonal festivals provided another outlet for romantic expression among common folk. Events like May Day celebrations or harvest festivals included traditional activities that encouraged interaction between young men and women, often with a degree of physical contact and flirtation that would have been scandalous in other contexts. These festivals served as pressure valves for romantic energy while maintaining overall social control. For a few days each year, normal rules were relaxed, allowing for courtship behaviours that helped people find partners while preserving the community's moral authority. Affairs among married peasants were handled differently than noble scandals. Since peasant marriages were primarily economic partnerships for survival, emotional infidelity was often tolerated as long as it didn't threaten the household's economic stability or result in children who would strain family resources. A woman might have an emotional relationship with another man as long as she continued to fulfill her domestic and agricultural responsibilities. a man might maintain relationships with multiple women as long as he supported his wife and legitimate children adequately. This doesn't mean peasant communities ignored adultery entirely, but their responses were more practical than moralistic. Public humiliation rituals like charivari might be used to shame couples whose affairs became too disruptive, but the goal was usually to restore social harmony rather than to punish sexual transgression. Village priests often served as informal marriage counsellors, helping couples navigate the practical and emotional challenges of peasant life. Their advice typically focused on maintaining household stability and raising children successfully rather than on achieving romantic fulfillment. But peasant communities also developed their own forms of romantic literature and cultural expression. Folk songs about tragic lovers, local legends about supernatural romance, and traditional dances that allowed for courtship behaviours all provided outlets for romantic imagination within socially acceptable frameworks. What emerges from the historical record is a picture of medieval common folk who were neither sexually repressed nor romantically naive, but who had developed sophisticated strategies for balancing individual desire with community survival needs. Their affairs and romantic relationships might have lacked the dramatic political consequences of noble scandals, but they reveal a deep understanding of human nature and social dynamics that often proved more sustainable than the rigid ideals promoted by church and aristocracy. Medieval urban centres like Paris, London, and the Italian city-states created different environments for romantic relationships, combining the economic opportunities that attracted migrants from rural areas with the anonymity that larger populations provided. Cities were where medieval people could most easily escape the social surveillance of traditional village life, and where new forms of romantic expression consequently developed. The growth of universities brought together young, educated people from different regions and social backgrounds, creating unprecedented opportunities for intellectual and emotional connections that cross traditional boundaries. Student life in medieval Paris or Oxford included not just formal education, but informal social networks that often developed into romantic relationships. University statutes officially prohibited relationships between students and local women, but these rules were routinely ignored. The tension between official celibacy requirements for clerical students and the reality of young people living in close proximity created a culture of romantic secrecy and creative rule-bending. Some of the most sophisticated medieval love poetry was written by university students, combining classical learning with personal experience in ways that created new forms of romantic expression. These weren't the courtly love traditions of noble courts, but more direct, emotionally honest explorations of attraction, desire, and relationship challenges. Urban merchant families developed their own approaches to marriage and romantic relationships, influenced by the need for business partnerships, but also by exposure to different cultural traditions through trade networks. Merchant marriages were often based on economic considerations, but the prosperity that successful trade provided created opportunities for emotional expression that were unavailable to subsistence-level peasants. Wealthy merchant families sometimes employed the services of professional matchmakers who considered not just financial and social compatibility, but also personality traits and personal preferences. This represented a middle ground between purely arranged marriages and individual choice that was uniquely urban and commercial. The growth of craft guilds created another context for romantic relationships, as apprentices and journeymen lived and worked in close proximity with master craftsmen's families. These relationships often led to marriages that combined personal attraction with professional advancement, as marrying a master's daughter or widow could provide access to guild membership and business opportunities. Urban religious communities also operated differently than their rural counterparts. City monasteries and convents were often involved in educational and charitable work that required extensive interaction with lay communities, creating more opportunities for personal relationships to develop. The famous affair between the French philosopher Pierre Abelard and his student Héloïse took place in this urban context, where intellectual collaboration between men and women was more common and socially acceptable than in rural areas. Their relationship was possible precisely because urban educational institutions created spaces for cross-gender intellectual interaction. Cities also provided more opportunities for extramarital affairs among married couples. The complexity of urban life, with its multiple social and professional networks, made it easier to conduct relationships outside of marriage without immediate detection by family and community members. Urban taverns, bathhouses, and markets served as informal social centres where people could meet and develop relationships outside of their immediate households and neighbourhoods. These spaces provided a degree of anonymity and social mixing that was impossible in smaller communities, but urban life also created new forms of romantic regulation. City governments developed laws governing sexual behaviour, marriage contracts, and family relationships that were often more detailed and strictly enforced than rural customs. The complexity of urban economic life required more formal legal frameworks for managing family property and inheritance. The result was an urban romantic culture that was simultaneously more free and more regulated than rural traditions, offering greater opportunities for individual choice while also subjecting personal relationships to new forms of legal and social oversight. Medieval people didn't just conduct their affairs in secret. They wrote about them, sang about them, and created an entire literary culture around the complexities of forbidden love. The development of vernacular literature in languages like French, English, and Italian provided new outlets for exploring romantic relationships in ways that Latin religious texts never could. The troubadour tradition that emerged in southern France during the 12th century represented a revolutionary approach to romantic expression. These poet-musicians created songs that celebrated earthly love, sexual desire, and emotional intimacy as positive forces rather than spiritual dangers. Troubadour poetry was explicitly erotic in ways that would have been impossible in religious contexts, but it was also sophisticated in its psychological analysis of attraction, jealousy, longing, and romantic fulfillment. These weren't simple expressions of lust, but complex explorations of how romantic relationships shaped individual identity and social relationships. The concept of courtly love that developed from troubadour culture provided a framework for thinking about affairs that acknowledged their emotional intensity while attempting to channel that intensity in socially acceptable directions. By emphasizing spiritual devotion and aesthetic appreciation over physical consummation, courtly love theory tried to create space for romantic feeling within Christian moral frameworks. But the actual practice of courtly love was often quite different from its theoretical ideals. Many of the relationships celebrated in courtly love poetry were clearly physical, as well as emotional, and the elaborate cultural apparatus of courtly love often served as sophisticated cover for conduct that would otherwise have been condemned as simple adultery. The rise of vernacular romance literature also created new models for thinking about marriage and love. Stories like the Arthurian legends, the romance of Tristan and Isolde, and the tales of courtly lovers provided narrative frameworks that helped people understand their own romantic experiences. These stories were simultaneously escapist fantasy and practical instruction, offering guidance about how to conduct affairs, how to manage conflicting loyalties, and how to balance romantic desire with social obligation. They created a shared cultural language for discussing topics that couldn't be addressed directly in religious or legal contexts. The popularity of romance literature also reflects the extent to which medieval people were interested in exploring emotional and sexual relationships despite official disapproval. The market for romantic stories suggests that there was a substantial audience of people who wanted to think about love, desire, and relationship challenges in more sophisticated ways than traditional moral instruction provided. Medieval romantic literature also reveals evolving attitudes toward women's agency and desire. Early courtly love poetry often portrayed women as distant, idealized objects of male devotion, but later romance literature increasingly explored women's perspectives, desires, and emotional experiences. Characters like Guinevere, Isolde, and the various heroines of medieval romance were complex figures who made active choices about their romantic relationships, even when those choices led to tragic consequences. They represented models of female agency that were often more progressive than the actual legal and social status of medieval women. The literary culture around medieval affairs also created opportunities for women writers to explore romantic themes. Authors like Marie de France wrote sophisticated analyses of love, desire, and relationship dynamics that provided female perspectives on topics usually dominated by male voices. Medieval people also understood that affairs had psychological consequences that extended far beyond immediate pleasure or political advantage. Without modern concepts of psychology or therapy, they nevertheless developed sophisticated ways of thinking about the emotional aftermath of romantic relationships and the long-term effects of romantic choices on individual well-being. The concept of lovesickness was taken seriously as a medical condition in medieval Europe. Physicians wrote treatises on the symptoms and treatments of amorherios, the disease supposedly caused by excessive romantic passion. Symptoms included insomnia, loss of appetite, fever, and melancholy that could allegedly progress to madness or even death if left untreated. While these medical theories were based on incorrect assumptions about physiology and psychology, they reflect genuine medieval awareness that intense romantic relationships could have profound effects on mental and physical health. The recommended treatments, including changes in diet, environment, and social activities, show practical understanding of how to manage emotional distress. Religious literature also explored the psychological dimensions of romantic relationships, particularly focusing on the tension between earthly love and spiritual devotion. Mystical writers like Bernard of Clairvaux developed sophisticated analyses of how romantic feeling could be transformed into religious experience, while moralists like Thomas Aquinas examined the ethical implications of different types of love and desire. Medieval people understood that affairs often began not from simple physical attraction, but from emotional needs that weren't being met in marriage or religious life. Loneliness, intellectual isolation, and the desire for understanding and appreciation were recognized as powerful motivating forces that could lead people into relationships they knew were dangerous. The medieval emphasis on confession as a religious practice also created a culture of psychological self-examination that extended to romantic relationships. People were expected to analyze their motivations, examine their consciences, and understand the spiritual implications of their choices. This confessional culture produced remarkable documents, like the letters of Abelard and Heloise, which reveal people engaged in sophisticated psychological analysis of their own romantic experiences. They understood that their relationship involved complex mixtures of intellectual attraction, emotional need, physical desire, and spiritual questioning that couldn't be reduced to simple categories of sin or virtue. Medieval literature also explored the long-term psychological consequences of romantic choices. Stories about lovers who sacrificed everything for passion often focused not just on the immediate dramatic outcomes, but on the years of regret, longing, and emotional complexity that followed romantic decisions. The concept of fin amour, or refined love, emphasized the educational and character-developing aspects of romantic experience. According to this tradition, even unsuccessful or tragic love affairs could contribute to personal growth and spiritual development by teaching people about the nature of desire, loyalty, and sacrifice. This psychological sophistication extended to understanding of how affairs affected not just the primary participants, but also spouses, children, and extended family members. Medieval people recognized that romantic relationships created complex webs of emotional obligation and potential hurt that needed to be managed carefully. The development of vernacular literature also provided outlets for exploring the psychological aftermath of affairs through fictional characters who could work through emotional consequences that real people had to suppress or hide. As medieval society evolved through the 13th and 14th centuries, changing economic conditions, new religious movements, and the gradual development of more centralized political authority created different contexts for romantic relationships and altered the social consequences of extramarital affairs. The growth of towns and the expansion of trade created new social mobility that disrupted traditional patterns of marriage and family formation. People who achieved economic success through commerce could aspire to marriages and social connections that would have been impossible under purely feudal systems. This social mobility also created opportunities for affairs that crossed traditional class boundaries. Wealthy merchants could pursue relationships with noble women, while successful craftspeople might attract attention from members of the lesser nobility. These relationships often had political as well as romantic implications, as they could serve as informal means of social advancement. The rise of lay religious movements, like the Beguines, created new options for women who wanted to avoid marriage without entering traditional convents. These semi-religious communities allowed women to maintain spiritual lives while retaining more personal autonomy than was possible in either marriage or formal religious orders. Some of these communities became centres for mystical and intellectual activity that attracted both men and women seeking spiritual and emotional connections outside of traditional frameworks. The famous Beguine mystic Marguerite Porete wrote extensively about the relationship between human love and divine love in ways that influenced both religious and romantic literature. The devastating effects of the Black Death in the 14th century disrupted traditional social structures and created new attitudes toward pleasure, mortality, and the value of earthly experience. In the aftermath of plague outbreaks that killed 1/3 of Europe's population, surviving populations often developed more permissive attitudes towards sexual and romantic behaviour. The economic disruption caused by plague mortality also created new opportunities for social mobility and unconventional relationships. With traditional family structures disrupted and labour shortages creating new economic opportunities, people had more freedom to pursue relationships based on personal choice rather than family obligation. The late medieval period also saw the development of more sophisticated legal frameworks for managing marriage, divorce, and property rights. While the Church continued to prohibit divorce, civil authorities developed increasingly complex systems for handling annulments, separations, and property disputes arising from failed marriages. These legal developments provided new options for people trapped in unsatisfactory marriages, reducing some of the pressure that had previously driven people into extramarital affairs as their only means of finding emotional satisfaction. The growth of universities and the expansion of literacy also created new forms of intellectual and cultural life that provided alternatives to traditional romantic relationships. People could find emotional fulfillment through scholarly work, artistic expression, and religious devotion in ways that reduced their dependence on romantic relationships for psychological satisfaction. But these same intellectual developments also created new sophistication in thinking about love, desire, and relationship ethics. Late medieval philosophers and theologians produced increasingly nuanced analyses of the relationship between reason and emotion, individual choice and social obligation, earthly love and spiritual devotion. The result was a late medieval culture that was simultaneously more tolerant of romantic diversity and more psychologically sophisticated in its understanding of relationship dynamics. People had more choices about how to structure their emotional lives, but they also had more complex frameworks for thinking about the consequences of those choices. This evolution culminated in the early Renaissance development of more individualistic approaches to love and marriage that would eventually transform European romantic culture entirely. But the foundations for these changes were laid in the medieval period's gradual recognition that personal happiness and social stability didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The medieval approach to managing affairs also reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between secrecy and social stability. Medieval people knew that complete suppression of romantic feeling was impossible, but they also understood that unregulated romantic expression could be socially destructive. The result was a complex system of partial tolerance and managed hypocrisy that allowed people to pursue emotional satisfaction while maintaining the appearance of social conformity. This system depended on everyone understanding the rules of discretion and agreeing to maintain public fictions even when private realities were quite different. Medieval courts developed elaborate etiquette systems that provided cover for romantic relationships while maintaining official moral standards. The same social rituals that regulated public behaviour also created opportunities for private communication and emotional expression. Religious institutions similarly developed practices that acknowledged human emotional needs while maintaining theological principles. The Catholic emphasis on confession and penance created frameworks for managing guilt and moral conflict that allowed people to pursue imperfect lives while working towards spiritual improvement. Even marriage itself became a more flexible institution over the course of the medieval period, as church and civil authorities developed increasingly sophisticated ways of handling marital problems that fell short of formal annulment or separation. The medieval period's approach to romantic affairs ultimately reflects a recognition that human emotional life is too complex to be managed through simple rules or absolute prohibitions. The sophisticated systems for managing romantic tension that developed during this period represent practical wisdom about balancing individual needs with social stability that remains relevant today. But perhaps the most important insight from the medieval approach to affairs is the recognition that romantic relationships are never purely private matters. They always exist within larger social, economic, and political contexts that shape their possibilities and consequences. Medieval people understood that love affairs could destabilize families, communities, and even kingdoms, but they also understood that attempting to suppress romantic feeling entirely was ultimately impossible and often counterproductive. Their approach was to create systems for channeling romantic energy in ways that minimized social disruption while acknowledging the fundamental human need for emotional connection. This balancing act required constant negotiation, creative compromise, and sophisticated social skills that medieval people developed to a remarkable degree. Their ability to maintain social cohesion while accommodating human emotional complexity offers lessons for any society trying to balance individual fulfillment with collective stability. The legacy of medieval approaches to love and affairs can be seen in the development of Renaissance humanism, Protestant ideas about marriage and sexuality, and eventually modern concepts of romantic love and individual choice. But the medieval recognition that personal relationships always have social dimensions remains relevant for understanding how romantic choices shape and are shaped by the communities in which they occur. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden chambers and secret gardens of medieval romance, it's worth reflecting on what these historical affairs reveal about the enduring tension between human desire and social order. Medieval people faced the same fundamental challenges that people face today: how to balance personal happiness with community responsibility, how to honour commitments while remaining true to authentic feelings, and how to navigate the complex intersection of love, power, and survival. What made medieval affairs particularly complex was the stark contradiction between official moral teaching and practical social reality. The Church taught that sexual desire should be confined to procreative marriage, but everyone knew that attraction, passion, and emotional need didn't follow theological guidelines. The feudal system demanded absolute loyalty and clearly defined relationships, but human feelings created bonds that cut across political boundaries and challenged hierarchical structures. The result was a culture that developed remarkably sophisticated strategies for managing these contradictions. Medieval people created courtly love traditions that elevated romantic feeling while theoretically avoiding physical consummation. They developed elaborate systems of coded communication that allowed emotional expression while maintaining plausible deniability. They used religious language to describe earthly passion and secular poetry to explore spiritual themes. They understood that complete honesty about romantic relationships would often be socially destructive, but they also recognized that complete suppression of romantic feeling was psychologically impossible. Their solution was to create spaces for managed discretion where people could pursue emotional satisfaction without directly challenging social authority. This approach required extraordinary social skill and psychological sophistication. Medieval people had to become experts at reading subtext, managing multiple layers of meaning in their communications, and navigating complex webs of competing loyalty and obligation. The affairs we've explored tonight, from legendary romances like Lancelot and Guinevere to historical relationships like Abelard and Heloise, reveal people who were anything but emotionally primitive or morally simplistic. They were complex individuals trying to honour their deepest feelings while surviving in social systems that often punished authentic emotional expression. Their strategies weren't always successful, and the consequences of discovery could be devastating. But their willingness to risk everything for moments of genuine connection speaks to the fundamental human need for love, understanding, and emotional intimacy that transcends historical periods and cultural differences. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people managed to create literature, art, and cultural traditions around forbidden love that continue to influence how we think about romance today. The concept of tragic love, the idea that passion can be simultaneously ennobling and destructive, and the tension between individual desire and social responsibility, all of these themes that dominate modern romantic culture have their roots in medieval attempts to understand the contradictions of the human heart. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might reflect on how the medieval approach to love affairs offers both inspiration and caution for navigating modern romantic life. Their recognition that love is never purely private, that romantic choices always have social consequences, and that managing the tension between personal desire and collective responsibility requires wisdom, skill, and considerable courage remains as relevant today as it was 800 years ago. The medieval lovers whose stories we've explored tonight understood something that we sometimes forget in our focus on individual happiness. That the most profound romantic relationships are those that somehow manage to honour both personal authenticity and social connection, that find ways to be true to the heart while remaining responsible to the community. Their affairs may have been conducted in castle chambers and monastery gardens rather than modern bedrooms and coffee shops. But the fundamental challenge they faced, how to love deeply and live ethically in a complex world, remains unchanged. And their sophisticated, if sometimes tragic, approaches to meeting that challenge continue to offer insights for anyone trying to navigate the eternal tension between what we want and what we owe to others. And so, we close tonight's exploration of medieval affairs with the recognition that love, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains one of the most human of experiences, capable of inspiring great art and causing great suffering, able to elevate the spirit and destabilize kingdoms, forever challenging us to find ways to honour both our deepest desires and our highest responsibilities. Sweet dreams, and may your own romantic choices be guided by wisdom gained through centuries of human experience, with the beautiful, terrible, transformative power of love.